Good afternoon. My name is Monique King-Veland, and I'm the Director of State and Local Housing Policy for the Urban Institute. And I'm also the moderator for the Revitalizing and Reimagining the DMV After COVID-19 event series. Today's event, entitled Canceling Rent and Promoting Housing Stability in Greater DC, is the first event in our series. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Before we start, a few quick housekeeping. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. Speaker bios are available online at urban.org, and a link to the bios will be posted in the chat. All participants are muted, but you can send questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time, and we hope to have enough time at the end for audience Q&A. And finally, if you tweet about the event, please tweet using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Thank you. As I mentioned, I'm the Director of State and Local Housing Policy, but immediately prior to joining Urban, I was the Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Development Authority, where I oversaw county funding for the development of affordable housing, public housing, and voucher administration for unincorporated Los Angeles County and dozens of local jurisdictions within the county. I spent the last 5 years on the front lines of the county's battle with housing affordability and homelessness. COVID-19 has laid waste to a housing infrastructure already in crisis, fueling housing instability and insecurity for millions of Americans, many right here in the greater DC region. Unemployment has surged. 1 out of every 5 rental households nationwide had at least one member who lost a job. Studies aimed at quantifying the impact of COVID-related job loss and economic hardship on renters' ability to pay rent indicate that between 29 to 43% of renter households were at risk of eviction before the CDC order was issued. Moreover, the global pandemic has disproportionately impacted Black and Latinx populations, widening racial inequities and creating unprecedented economic hardships. Black and Latinx people faced higher levels of eviction and housing instability even before the crisis, and all signs point to a greater risk of eviction during the pandemic. Back rent estimates alone range from $7 billion to more than $70 billion, depending on the source. And even with the additional $25 billion in emergency rental assistance about to hit the streets as part of the recent stimulus, and the national eviction moratorium extended through March, the rent will inevitably still come due. So the timing of this conversation couldn't be better. Our panelists this afternoon will provide a contextualized understanding of the impact of COVID on housing and economic stability in the greater DC region, and discuss some potential policy solutions like canceling rent. So I'm honored to be joined today by Michael Cohen. Michael is a research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center here at Urban. His work focuses on affordable housing, neighborhood initiatives, and community development. Before joining Urban, Michael was a policy and development associate at the National Housing Trust, and he holds a BA in government from the University of Virginia and an MPP from Georgetown University. Citlali Velasquez is a tenant organizer with the Latino Economic Development Center, organized working class tenants of color in DC to challenge landlord abuse and displacement. She helps tenants harness their collective power to guarantee safe and secure housing. And our last panelist, though certainly not least, is Delegate Janelle Wilkins. Delegate Wilkins proudly represents Montgomery County in the Maryland House of Delegates 20th Legislative District. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, she is dedicated to policy change that makes a difference in people's lives. Delegate Wilkins is a champion for affordable housing and has also successfully passed legislation dealing with racial profiling and justice reform, maternal health, and increasing educational equity. So please join me in virtually welcoming our panelists. So let's start with Michael. I know that DC, there are nearly 60% of the residents rent their homes, and more than 1/10 of renters did not pay their rent on time or deferred a payment this summer. And the percentages were even higher in Maryland and Virginia. Can you shed light on the story that the data is telling about how COVID has specifically impacted the greater DC region from a housing and economic stability perspective?
Sure, thank you, Monique. So the first thing that I would say is that the data make clear that even with the additional proposed 30 billion in assistance in the American Rescue Plan, that wouldn't get us to the full amount of need that exists. There was a paper by Moody Analytics and an Urban Institute fellow, Jim Parrott, who put the total amount of need in January at 57 billion. So what that tells us that is that even with the additional rent relief, if that proposed bill goes through, we would still need additional assistance. It also tells us that that only accounts for back rent. It doesn't account for the accrual going forward. So there are estimates within Urban that have put the additional monthly need based on job loss at around 66 million per month. So as long as this pandemic is accruing in DC, and that number raises to 315 in Virginia and 251 million in Maryland. And so that tells us that there's going to be ongoing need. The other thing that I would point out is that you've already touched on it. As with most American problems, racism means that sort of Black and brown folks are most at risk of being harmed by inaction. So in the DC region, Black and Latinx folks were almost 20 percentage points more likely to have no or slight confidence in being able to pay next month's rent. The other thing that I would put a quick pin in that you've already mentioned is this idea that the crisis related to the pandemic is a supercharging of an ongoing crisis. And so there are a couple of data points there. The National Low Income Housing Coalition puts out an incredible report each year called Out of Reach that compares minimum wage to fair market rent. And this statistic always strikes me that there are 0% of states, metropolitan areas, or counties across the US where working the prevailing minimum wage for a 40-hour week will allow you to afford a modest 2-bedroom rental. If you're talking about 1-bedroom rental, that goes up to 5%. So this is not a new crisis. That is also true of this region. My colleagues at the Urban Greater DC wrote a report in 2019 called Meeting the Washington Region's Future Housing Needs. So over 75% of households in this region with incomes below $54,000 a year, this is renters and homeowners, by the way, are housing burden, meaning they pay over 30% of their income towards rent or their mortgage. So the data tells us that this is really a crisis that is on top of an existing crisis.
Thank you, Michael. So we were in a crisis before the crisis. That's a good segue to Setlali. As an organizer on the front lines and someone who clearly recognizes that we were in a crisis before the crisis, how has the economic hardships, though, of COVID affected then the efforts to strengthen conversations around rent control or proposals like canceling rent?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And yeah, I will say that there was already a housing crisis, and I will say that now we're in a housing disaster, a housing catastrophe. Tenants were already fighting for their lives before, and I think this moment, it's hard to have one generalization and say all tenants have responded in the same way, but I will say that our efforts to cancel rent, to strengthen rent control, there's been more tenants that have been called to action, and I don't say that to romanticize that, but I just want to speak on my observations, and that tenants have been forced to organize, to fight, tooth and nail, because simply the law was just not enough to protect tenants, particularly Black and brown tenants who, have been essential workers during the pandemic, and who have been, having to choose between food and shelter, and so we've seen a rise in tenants organizing rent strikes and trying to pressure their landlords to forgive their rent, to cancel their rent, and joining larger efforts in DC to cancel rent across DC. And so, yeah, as I said earlier, there was, I would say on average in our organizing team at LEDC, there was between 1 to 2 rent strikes a year. Now, all of our organizers have doubled in their kind of caseload organizing of rent strikes. And it's really because of the situation. Tenants are being forced to, to organize when the law is just simply not enough, and so that's a little bit of kind of my experience. And yeah, the circumstances have really forced tenants to challenge the status quo, and like this really deep desire to survive, and really a grain of hope, just really keeping folks going, not really having a choice. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. In terms of cancel rent, I will say that the cancel rent effort was in direct response to the pandemic, whereas the reclaim rent control has been an ongoing effort over the past 10 years to strengthen rent control. And so I don't think that it should be an issue of like one or the other. I think cancel rent and rent control are just as important for the short term and the long term. If we don't cancel rent now, tenants will have a burden of living with the effects of displacement, of homelessness, of all the mental health issues that can come with being displaced. So cancel rent isn't just as a response to kind of the immediate, but it's a long-term plan as well. Same with rent control, and so yeah, like I said, people have been joining these efforts more, and it's been, I think, as a direct response to the pandemic in an effort to survive.
Thank you. Michael, can you briefly repeat the statistic that you mentioned about the percentage of homeowners and renters who earn less than the 54,000 who are housing burdened?
Yeah, so 75% of households who make under 54,000 a year are housing burden.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. So we've heard how the change and sort of the housing crisis that is now a housing catastrophe, as Sitlali said, has shifted the work on the ground. I want to turn to Delegate Wilkins and talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has opened the doors for government also to consider more progressive policy options like canceling rent. I've read that the General Assembly is considering an ambitious housing justice package. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the proposed COVID-19 Eviction Relief Act of 2021 that you're sponsoring.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you again for inviting me and having me be part of this panel and able to discuss my favorite topic when it comes to housing and my #1 priority for this legislative session. We are in session right now, currently remote, but coming in person in mid-February in the legislative session in Maryland. So I always like to conversations, especially as it relates to some of the work that's being done to respond to the pandemic around housing, by really reflecting on the fact that during this pandemic, home has been health. It's been a lifeline. It has been protection. It has been safety. And it has been really one of the only ways that people have been able to survive by staying home. And I know in the state of Maryland, for the last 10 years, it feels like 10 years, for the last 10 months, we have asked residents to stay at home. And now with so many people, as has been mentioned in terms of the statistics and the numbers, so many people at risk of losing their homes, we have to work to ensure that people keep the roof over their heads, not only during this pandemic, but that we are never in such a place again where people continue to have their housing be unstable. I'm a renter in my district. I rent in the district that I represent. And it's never been more clear how much as a renter, your life, your health, your safety, a lot of it is dependent upon, your landlord doing the right thing And we've really seen that in the pandemic as well. And so much of what we're talking about today, whether it's the imbalance of power between landlords and tenants, whether it is lack of affordability and the housing burden that many people face, these issues have been systemic and they have been long lasting way before COVID-19. And so the legislation that myself and my colleagues have introduced are a mix of trying to keep people housed during and after the pandemic, but also looking at those systemic long-term issues and proposing solutions for the long term as well. And because of COVID-19, we're really seeing colleagues pay more attention to housing issues. And we're having conversations such as around canceling rent and rent control that would have been dead on arrival and very difficult to have a serious conversation about before this pandemic. So in terms of the legislation that we're looking at, because several colleagues have introduced bills related to housing and housing relief and renters' rights, we put these bills together in a package that we were calling the Housing Justice Package. And so there are a couple of bills that hit on a few different topics. Mine is the COVID-19 Eviction Relief Act of 2020. And that includes a complete moratorium on evictions, except in cases of extreme emergency. It includes a ban on late fees and fines and rent increases. It also includes a rent relief fund to help make sure that people are able to either eliminate or pay down really strongly their rent debt. Other bills that have been introduced include foreclosure prevention, because we're making sure that we're including some homeowner provisions as well, moratorium on foreclosures and forbearance reform. And then getting back to the renters, we have legislation on right to counsel in eviction proceedings. We won't be able to cover everyone, but the bill includes folks who are at $50,000 income or less, so we can focus in on some of the mid to lower income Marylanders when it comes to eviction proceedings. And it includes increasing our filing fees. We have a $15 filing fee when it comes to filing as a landlord for eviction. So as you can imagine, just going to the court and filing your $15 is just so easy, and it's one of the lowest amounts in the entire country. And so looking to increase that fee, and then other provisions that make the eviction process more rigorous so that we can help protect renters. So there's a number of different provisions in our bills. And finally, I just want to mention that yesterday I had a call with a constituent in my district who shared that he was in debt and owing to his landlord over $22,000. I mean, this is an amount that's not something that even our rent relief program, right? We're looking at maybe a couple $1,000s, but to $22,000, I mean, that's getting up there with my student loans that I've been paying for over 10 years now. So the idea of rent cancellation, I think, really needs to re-emerge, including in Maryland, as a really serious topic, because if we're really looking to address this issue, someone who is in debt at $22,000, being able to cancel the rent and also provide full forgiveness, I think is going to be absolutely critical. So I did want to raise that as well.
Thank you, Delegate Wilkins. I want to go back a little bit. Michael mentioned this, and Sitlali, you mentioned this as well, about the disproportionate impact that the data is showing on Black and Latinx households. Sitlali, what do you think local government leaders, local change makers on the ground need to be doing to address the disparities and the disproportionate impact on people of color and to protect communities of color in particular?
Yeah, I will say that, I agree with a lot of what Janelle Wilkins was saying. And I think local government leaders need to listen to their constituents who need them the most, whose livelihoods are and have been at stake. To listen to working class tenants of color as if they're policy advocates, as if they're experts and have the solutions. I know cancel rent has been a movement in DC and nationally. And in DC, we're proposing for a landlord and homeowner relief funds where landlords can apply for rental assistance and then pass that rent forgiveness to tenants. And I think that kind of surpasses the whole landlords being like, well, how am I going to pay my bills? And so, it's not a completely radical idea. just as tenants are applying for basically to pay their landlord's mortgage, during a pandemic, it would kind of, get around all of those barriers that tenants are already having to experience when they're applying for rental assistance programs that have so many barriers, that have a plethora of documentation that some tenants might not have if they're working in informal economies, or if they're undocumented. And so there's, I think that we see this kind of landlord fund as a way, as a path towards canceling rent in DC. And so I'm hopeful that, local government leaders in DC will really see cancel rent as a solution. And that it is already kind of a compromise, it's not this radical, like, well, who cares what happens to landlords? We know that the landlord and developer lobbies are really strong in DC, and I assume they are across the country. And so this isn't necessarily an attack on their finances either. And if they really need that support, then they can apply for that landlord fund and not put that burden on working class tenants of color.
Thank you. I want to stay on the topic of sort of disproportionate impact, Black, Latinx communities. Delegate Wilkins, we've been talking a little bit about the fact that COVID-19 has exacerbated an existing rental crisis problem, right? Crisis, now catastrophe in our communities. And Michael touched briefly on the notion of it, they're also just being sort of rooted in structural racism, discriminatory laws, and other things, right? How are government leaders moving from sort of awareness to action? For example, does the proposed housing justice package attempt to also address the disproportionate impact of COVID and COVID housing related insecurities and instabilities on communities of color?
Thank you. That's a great question. And absolutely, I think that in our policy making, we have to recognize and craft policy that really demonstrates the fact that certain communities are much more impacted than others. I have been introducing rent legislation for a couple years now. And when courts were more open and we could physically attend, I would sit in court, and it was very stark, the people that you would see there. All people of color, people who had physical disabilities, the ones that I could at least see, and people who were non-English speaking. And that's what the numbers are also showing us. And anyone who pops into rent court in their community can also see that. So it's critical that our policies really look to that. I think in terms of the bills that we've introduced and how they are particularly making sure that we're reflecting that in our policy making is, I think the fact that the right to counsel bill, for example, is really focusing in on folks who are at the lower end in terms of income, and that we're focusing on making sure that they have a right to counsel. The way that the moratorium is also crafted really keeps in mind what was just mentioned from Ms. Velasquez around sometimes with policies in place, there's such a high, there are high barriers to entry. So whether it's a whole lot of paperwork, or we put it on the renter to have to show, that they have this impact from COVID-19. And by the time they go through all this paperwork, it's hard for them to even apply and be able to be considered. So the straight up moratorium where we're saying we're not going to evict anyone and not have all of this level of paperwork, I think is really critical, outside of emergency situations. But I think that piece really takes in mind the purpose for that is us making sure that we're not having those sort of barriers to entry and putting it on the renter. I didn't mention the know your rights aspect as well, because we find that in the communities that I mentioned, there's a lot of asymmetric information. And so the legislation, my bill, requires dissemination of know your rights information, where we're also relying on landlords as well when a lease is executed to share that information. That's something that we do already in the county that I represent, where there's certain landlord tenant information that you have to share. And then as well, when a landlord decides to file a complaint, you also have to give the person their rights so that they are aware of what resources there are, what protections they have. So there's some things that we try to make sure that we included in terms of ensuring and knowing and understanding that there are particular communities that are disproportionately impacted when it comes to eviction issues.
Thank you. I want to go back to Michael. There are strong voices and opinions on all sides of the canceling rent debate, from tenants to landlords to advocacy groups. Can you give us a snapshot of the arguments in the debate and what the data is actually saying about canceling rent?
Sure, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's an interesting situation in which, at a base level, there's a lot of overlap, right? Tenants want rent relief, landlords want rent relief, advocates want rent relief, tenants want it to be more straightforward, landlords do too. I think where you get into the heated pieces of the arguments are in the details, right? Like, how are we doing it? Who is it for? And I think from the landlord perspective, landlords want the sort of full entirety of the back rent. They want to be able to sort of collect on the full sort of amount of rent that they're owed. And I think also you see landlord advocacy groups challenging pieces of the moratorium, indicating that they also want the flexibility to be able to evict their tenants after this. Understanding this sort of uncertainty moving forward, they want that flexibility. And I think part of what sort of underlies that argument is the sort of concept of the kind of mom and pop landlord, the person who, without this rent, their sort of mortgage is at risk. Without being able to collect the full back rent, their own sort of ability to not be foreclosed upon is at risk. And I think from the sort of tenant perspective, the tenant advocate perspective, I think they would say, or there's a sort of element of like those landlords do exist, but there are also slumlords who own hundreds of properties. There are also sort of large landlords who, for whom being a landlord is sort of part of, collecting large profits on rents. And so I think part of it becomes this question of, how are we dictating I think it's the sort of question of, when we talk about tenants accessing the sort of social safety net, they're often required to demonstrate need. There are often sort of requirements that are built into the receipt of that aid. And so I think there's a question of, can that be a part of how we provide aid when it's directed to landlords, right? Can we treat sort of mom and pop landlords who might need that full sort of rent relief differently than we might treat large landlords? Are there ways that localities can use the sort of leverage of providing 4 months of aid to cancel all of back rent for landlords who can build that into their business model? So I think it's a sort of question of delineating when it comes to sort of folks who are experiencing poverty or tenants. There's sort of all these policy levers that we have to sort of target need. I think we need to think about how to use those when it comes to landlords, so that the mom and pop landlords who really need that support get it in a streamlined way, and some of the landlords who might be able to eat some of that sort of back rent are able to do that as well.
Thank you. There are a ton of questions coming through in the Q&A, so I want to give opportunity to get to those as well. But I want to ask one last question to each of the panelists, and maybe Michael, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Setlali and then Delegate Wilkins. Is there a path forward towards an equitable recovery in the greater DC region that does not include at least considerations of policies like rent control and canceling rent? Michael, we'll start with you.
No. Yeah, I don't think, I think, well, the data suggests that the sort of amount of need requires some policy. We can debate about, is it full rent relief? Is it rent relief and rent forgiveness? I think those are all questions, but, one of the data points that I've seen is sort of, as we've noted, some estimates put 10 million renters at risk of eviction across the nation. For reference, there are around 7 million folks who are facing foreclosure during the foreclosure crisis. And so I think we need the sort of idea of whether we need to act, I think, isn't really a question. I think to prevent an eviction crisis, there needs to be something.
Lally?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think that there is. I think we've seen the alternative paths to this moment. We've seen what alternative paths the local DC officials have enacted, and we know that those are not enough. So based off of, I think this previous experience with other programs, knowing that that's not enough, we know that canceling rent control is the path forward. And I don't see how there could be an equitable recovery without those programs. DC residents have already been displaced even during the pandemic, and I don't know what that data is or looks like. And I think that the officials are relying on kind of firsthand experiences, and it just, who has a closer relationship with, officials, and who are they listening to, and there's definitely a disparity in what data they're looking at. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Delegate Wilkins?
Yes, thank you. I think that for where we are and meeting the moment, understanding the history and the systemic issues, we cannot accept anything less than robust and bold legislation and funding, both eviction relief, making sure that there is funding to pay down rent and eliminate rent debt, but also policy solutions, long-term policy changes that really reflect the imbalance of power and that really help ensure secure and stable and healthy and safe housing for the long term. So I would really sum it up in terms of both the policy and the money. And making sure that we're not only addressing the issues related to this crisis, but the long-standing issues as well. As it relates to rent cancellation and rent control specifically, in Montgomery County, we are having a really important conversation and a first step and legislation that has been introduced around rent control, looking at, to start, areas that are 1 mile outside of some of our key transit areas, and putting forth some rent control provisions in those areas specifically. And I think that conversation would not have been able to really happen outside of, very unfortunately, right, but outside of the current situation that we're in this emergency and this pandemic and crisis. When it comes to rent cancellation, I'm defining cancellation as no one has to pay rent. I've called for that previously. However, I need 72 votes to pass a bill. And right now, the focus, at least in Maryland, is on having robust relief and financially making sure that landlords and tenants are able to pay down their debt. So that's where we are right now.
Thank you. Thank all three of you. So we're going to go to some of the questions that are in the Q&A box. Michael, I think this first question is for you. Given the data that Michael presented regarding minimum wage not being a livable wage in any metro area, how much of the solution is rent control versus need for a living wage to address all costs of living?
So I think the answer is yes. Both of those things. I think we need to, as Delegate Wilkins mentioned, I think we need to open up the playbook. As we've talked about, this crisis isn't new. We need sort of what we've tried before, what we've been doing in the past isn't solving it on a long-term basis. And so I think policies like rent control, which get us closer to sort of decommodifying housing, turning it from like a way to make profit to a sort of, acknowledging it as home, as something sacred, as well as sort of providing folks with livable wages. I think both of those are important.
Thank you. There was another question in the box for Delegate Wilkins. Have you engaged banks to see if they can reduce or forgive mortgage payments for landlords that reduce or forgive rent for their tenants?
It's a great question. Members of the Housing Justice Coalition have reached out. I think some of the feedback has been okay, where are we going to be made whole in terms of the banks and the lenders as well? So it sort of becomes this cycle conversation. Back when there was expected to be sort of maybe a bigger bailout for some banks and some lenders, that conversation was a bit more promising. But so there are folks who have communicated with banks and lenders around, you know, how the rent cancellation could happen. But I would say there's mostly opposition for that from property managers, from landlords, and from the banks as well.
Thank you. And Delegate Wilkins, you did a great job of defining what you meant by rent cancellation or canceling rent. One of the questions in the chat was, does canceling rent mean rental assistance, or does it also include something like canceling debt without making a payment? Can each of you speak to what you mean by canceling rent?
I can take that real quickly, and I'll pass it to Solali maybe. What I mean by canceling rent is starting at the baseline of assuming that no one is sort of meeting the rental needs of everyone so that no one is evicted during this current crisis. I think there are multiple ways of doing it. I think it includes rent relief, but I think it also includes using partial rent relief as a way of including cancellation of past debt. And also sort of future forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that cancel rent is a form of eviction prevention. I don't see kind of eviction prevention happening without a form of canceling rent. In DC, we have looked at cancel rent in like as kind of like a landlord and homeowner relief fund. And so I think it's gonna come down to like the nitty gritty in terms of like how much, you know, and like, you know, if there's gonna be enough funds for like full cancellation or full relief or like partial, and kind of where there can be some compromise. And I think it's a little hard also to kind of have like hard numbers in terms of these suggestions and policy proposals because landlords like accounting books are not like something that are public, and it's hard to know like how much landlords are actually losing. On the other end of the spectrum, tenants are often forced to kind of provide like every single you know receipt and proof of like that they've lost income. And so I think it's when kind of both parties are not like, you know, able to be completely honest and share, it's hard to kind of find a solution that will meet both of the parties' needs. And so I think this moment really calls for honesty, for compassion, for transparency. All moments do, but I think this moment really calls for that. And yeah, I see canceling rent as at the baseline, forgiving rents for tenants that have suffered income loss or have experienced COVID or who have had to leave their jobs during COVID to care for family members. I think not everyone has experienced economic hardship in the same ways, and so I think that this also has to be a flexible relief program. And sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit, but yeah, I think also I know someone asked about homeowners, and that's definitely something that the Council Rents DC Coalition has been thinking about and partnering with homeowners, and kind of where there is room for collaboration.
Thank you. One final question that was in the Q&A was around advocacy on evictions. Delegate Wilkins, you mentioned that the portion of the package that you were sponsoring was specifically related to evictions. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also then, Sitlali, do you have any resources or information on advocacy around eviction prevention as well?
Yeah, so most of the policies in the housing package are related to renters and eviction issues. So again, that includes everything from the moratorium to the rent relief funding to help make sure that people are able to pay down or pay off their housing debt. So it is very much focused on it. And there, in terms of the advocacy aspect, there are several organizations from CASA to other groups across our region and our state that have been working to make sure the voices of renters in particular are being heard in the advocacy. There's nothing that we do in terms of events and organizing to push these bills where we don't make sure that the voices and the stories of the renters who are directly impacted are being heard. And I think that that's powerful and important, especially because, at least in Maryland, our courts in a lot of ways have shut down due to COVID-19. So a lot of these cases aren't being heard. So what that means is that as legislators, our phones are not ringing off the hook necessarily. Knowing that so many people are at risk of eviction, we're not always seeing and hearing from our constituents on it because the courts are shut down and the proceedings haven't been taking place. And so being able to lift up that this is real, that people are afraid of their insecure housing situation and that the health risk of it all is really important. So that's what's been happening in terms of some of the advocacy around it. And that's where our policies have been focused.
Thank you. So Ali?
Yeah, I did speak on this a little earlier in that cancel rent is an eviction prevention policy. And so, you know, we really don't see there being eviction prevention without canceling rent. The moratorium is only going to last for so long. And once that is over, courts are going to reopen, courts are going to process evictions. And courts are made to process evictions rather quickly. You know, court hearings can happen within the span of a couple of months to weeks, depending on whether the tenant has, you know, right to counsel and you know, is informed around their rights. And so, you know, I will say that advocates are kind of involved in like a little bit of everything, you know, and it's kind of, we don't really see this as like a piecemeal approach, rather like an ecosystem of things that tenants are going to need to really come out this strong, and not just strong, but just, you know, survive. And so some of that is like dabbling a little bit in like canceling rent and, you know, in advocacy around the moratorium, around rental assistance programs. You know, just it's kind of an ecosystem for all of this to kind of come together in a way where tenants can really survive. And so the moratorium currently in DC, I know it's a little different than Maryland, but while evictions are prohibited, there have been some evictions that have been heard, and the landlord lobbies have constantly tried to chip away at the moratorium. And so even with the moratorium, we have seen evictions, we have seen illegal evictions happen. And so, you know, we think that the moratorium needs to be strengthened, and there needs to be, the cancel rent is a policy for preventing eviction in the near future. And they're gonna have to go hand in hand.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. I want to lift up a couple of things that I heard that struck me. 75% of households who earn less than $54,000 a year, homeowners and renters, are housing cost burden, 75%. We were in a higher housing crisis. We are now in a housing catastrophe. But the other thing that I heard and that I'm confident about is that change makers who are on the front lines, like Sitlali at the Latino Economic Development Center, and those in the legislature, like Delegate Wilkins, are heeding the call and responding to the crisis at hand. And I think if nothing else, that gives me hope today and this afternoon. I want to thank the panelists, Michael, Sitlali, Delegate Wilkins, for their incredible insights this afternoon. And I want to thank everyone who registered and joined us today. Again, today's event is the first in a series of events on revitalizing and reimagining the DMV after COVID-19, where we will continue to bring together subject matter experts and local change makers working on the ground to discuss policies that will help us focus not just on where we want to go or where we are, but what we can be, reimagining a DMV for all of its residents. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you all at the next event in the series. Good afternoon.